My name is Cindy Falteich. I'm a comedian, author, and blogger, and I want to welcome you to this episode of What Was I Thinking? In this series, I'm going to try to address some of the things I've done in my life that people might have thought were crazy. I'm going to talk about my impetus for those crazy things that I did, and maybe something that I mentioned will resonate with you and give you the courage to do those things that people might think are off the wall as well. I'm grateful for the things that I've done, even if they may have been painful or have ended poorly at times, because they've got me to where I am. It's given me the opportunity to write 6 novels and 2 screenplays. One of those novels is a 5-star read on Amazon, and it's also considered a great summer beach read, so if you like something spicy, don't hesitate to check that out. It's called The Revolution of Charlotte Smith. I'm also the author of 3 blogs, Politically Incorrect, which is politically incorrect thoughts on the Philadelphia Phillies, as well as abnormalmom.com, which is a collection of essays on finding grace during the not-so-finer points in life. And last but not least is Cindy's A to Z's of Comedy. I wrote that as a contribution to the A to Z blog challenge, which is held in April every year. So I'm also going to be concentrating on why I wrote some of the stuff that I did, how I did my research, and the finer points of writing, working with people. For instance, right now I'm working with a veteran Hollywood producer who's in love with a short novel that I wrote that he would like to adapt to a screenplay. However, he first wants to get me an agent and get me published in the traditional sense, which is always exciting because I don't know if you've queried, but it's not the most fun thing to do, but it is a necessary evil. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things about writing, a lot of things about the books, the research, the crazy shit that I've done, as I've mentioned. So if you have any questions or want me to cover some things or just want me to rant about something that's on your mind about this industry or writing or anything in life, I'm happy to address those items. So let's get started. Here's my inaugural episode of What Was I Thinking? In this episode, I'm going to cover why I started writing. This happened over 10 years ago, and at the time, I had a wonderful little business. It was a boutique and niche business in which I did personal bookkeeping and personal services for a very small number of affluent clients. I loved them. I loved what I was able to do for them, but because of a number of circumstances in my life, it led to a moment of complete despair and depression. My relationship was horrible. I felt I had no self-worth whatsoever, and as a result, I found myself sitting in the basement of my home and my rented home because my intent was twofold. I wanted to kill myself in a place that would leave less of a mess for the landlord, and I also wanted to make sure that I did that in a place where my child wouldn't be the first one to find me. Since he was about 8 at the time, I chose that basement because I knew that he was afraid to descend the stairs by himself. As a result, I knew my husband would be the first to find me, which might seem a little cruel at the time, but if you've ever been in the position where you're contemplating just ending the despair, you might understand that it's a self-preservation move. You're sure that everyone would be better off without you. You're sure that you're not contributing anything to anybody's life and that you're just a bad example of despair and depression. And that's what led me to my decision. Now, fortunately, as I was sitting in my basement, I allowed myself a moment of reflection and peace. At the time, I didn't realize it, but what I did was I allowed myself to be present in the moment. And then that one tiny moment, which I'm sure a higher power somewhere was begging me to do this for years, I shut it all off and I just sat with the feeling that very soon that deep, dark despair that I had housed for years and years and had grown and morphed into this horrible monster would be gone. And in that moment of clarity, I felt what it would be like to be free of it. A voice made it through. And that voice said, "You got yourself here. You can get yourself out." So I did. I dropped all thought of suicide. I went back to work. I caught up on my stuff. And I decided, first and foremost, I wanted to sell my business. And lo and behold, not long after that, I was approached by a 26-year-old young man who seemed very ambitious at the time and really liked my business model and paid me graciously for my business and for what I had built for my clients. Now, later on, he went on to embezzle in excess of $20 million from not only my clients that he had taken from me, but his as well. And so he spent some time in jail. That's another story. But for the time being, it was exactly what I'd asked for, and I had all the confidence in the world that he would take over my customers exactly as, and serve them exactly as I had. I felt a lot of connection with my clients. I wanted them to be in good hands. But I also wanted to do something by the time that I was in my mid-40s that I had still not done, and that was to start writing. But first, what's interesting is I sold my business. It was late in the year, and I remember spending January and February thinking, well, I need to get into a position where I can really dedicate myself to writing. And before I know it, 2 months had passed, and I didn't have a word written, nothing. So then I decided to use this old laptop that we had that had no access to the internet, no access to a wireless connection. It was just a dummy laptop with Microsoft Word on it, and all I could do as I sat in that room was put words on a page. I couldn't surf the net. I couldn't play solitaire. I could play nothing. And to prepare for that, I did a meditation by Shakti Gawan, some type of visualization meditation. And the funny thing is, as soon as I did that meditation, the next day, I started having stories connect with me. And I noticed very early on that it was my job to listen to the stories and then capture them on page that would resonate with an audience. I practiced and I practiced night after night until I'd written 1, and then I'd written 2, and then I'd written 3 and 4 and 5, and now I'm on my 6th. Now my 4th one is The Revolution of Charlotte Smith. There's a story behind Rev because it's been rebranded and renamed a couple of times, because what I figured out very early on is I stink at title conception and cover conception. People had reached out to me and said, your cover doesn't represent what the story's about. Your title sucks. Right now it's called The Revolution of Charlotte Smith. It's a 5-star read on Amazon. And I recently received a question from a reader who asked why I chose to base that book in the world of the professional bull riders, the PBR, which is an actual professional bull riding organization. So I thought it was a great question, and I thought it might interest people who are interested in rodeo and or like that type of stuff. So the answer to her question is, at one point in time, I was conceiving of, I'd written 3 novels, and I was fooling around with what my next novel might be based on, and I really wanted I wanted it to have a female character, which my 3rd novel did as well. So one day, when I was in a house of someone that I knew, their 17-year-old daughter came up to me and had some very strong feelings about the way she had been raised. She'd been raised in a very affluent household, but she still felt as if she was not allowed to explore those things about herself that might be her. So I took that conversation, and in my head, there was a character that came out of that, and her name was Charlotte Smith. Charlotte Smith is a very affluent young woman. She's grown up rich, but her parents have great expectations for her that she believes don't match what she actually wants for her life. So she doesn't feel as if she has lived the life she wants to live. And that's her goal now, is to go out and do that. But they are, of course, squelching that desire. She's going to be a senior in high school. So to spite her very controlling parents, she decides to stage her disappearance. And as a result of a criminal act, she is offered an out by a good Samaritan who gives her the option to stay and face the consequences of this criminal act or to get in her truck. And at that point, she becomes a reluctant guest of 4 bull riders on their way to a 4-day professional bull riding event. The reason I chose the bull riders is because I wanted to plunge Charlotte deep into a world much unlike her own. I wanted her to be in shock for what she was witnessing, and I thought the PBR was probably a pretty good place to start. What's interesting about the PBR is in the late 90s, I was living in Amarillo, Texas. There was a rumor that some PRCA bull riders wanted to start their own organization because they felt as if bull riding was the main draw at a rodeo. I could agree, it's probably the most exciting. But of course, the joke was that they're bull riders, what would they know about that? Years later, 10, 12, 15 years later, I'm sitting in my rental home and we're channel surfing. And here comes, I think it was Versus, maybe the Versus channel or Outdoor Life, whatever that channel was back then. We're channel surfing and on comes this program called the PBR, the Professional Bull Riders. And I thought to myself, by God, they did it. They got it done. So I did some research, and in 1992, 20 of the best bull riders in the United States each put $1,000 into a pot to start this organization. What's interesting is, at the time, they're the number 1 bull riders in the association, in the PRCA. They're making more money than any. They're more successful than any other bull riders. And some of them actually had to borrow $1,000 to put into the pot. So I applaud them because they also made a great backstory for my book. For about a year, my family and I watched everything PBR. We watched every event, every documentary. There was a lot of 30-minute outtakes with Craig Hummer, like little 30-minute segments on bulls and bull riders and the event and all these other things. I loaded myself with as much information as I possibly could about the PBR. I also hung out with some rodeo types in the day. That helped give me a lot of perspective about buckle bunnies and what happens behind the scenes. And as a result, came up with the idea for the Revolution of Charlotte Smith.
This is Cindy Falteich. You can find more information about me at www.cindyfalteich.com. I also Google easily because I'm the only Cindy Falteich in the world. If you have any questions or need more information, please don't hesitate to visit my website. If you'd like to get in touch, go to the bottom of the page, click Contact Me, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of What Was I Thinking?